On the slopes of Diamond Head, this is Kapiolani Community College. Kulia ika nu'u, strive for the highest.
Aloha. Welcome to the Legal Environment of Business, BLAW200. My name's Ben Carroll. Well, we've been looking at corporations, and today we're going to go a little farther into that. We'll talk about mergers and acquisitions. We'll talk about the financing. We'll talk a little bit about antitrust and monopolies, and then a little bit about corporate responsibilities. Harken back a little bit to our discussion of business ethics. But first, as always, let's take a look at what we covered last time. Make sure that that's seated in your memory banks. So, who are the owners of a corporation, and what management responsibilities do they have as owners? Well, the owners of the corporation are the shareholders or stockholders, and the way they become shareholders is simply to acquire shares, legally, hopefully. So, they either purchase shares or are gifted or inherit shares, and that makes them shareholders or owners of the corporation. So what do they get to do as owners? Well, as we've talked about, they are separated from the day-to-day management, and that's one of the reasons that they are protected from individual and personal liability. So what do they get to do? Well, they have the right to vote, so they can vote for the board of directors. They can choose the top management during the annual meetings. As we discussed, a lot of people really don't participate in that. They can attend the annual meetings. They have a right to see certain records, etc. They can sometimes vote on major changes that will affect their stock ownership. So if there are sometimes mergers, acquisitions, or getting rid of corporate property, that sort of thing. But they are divorced from the day-to-day management. You recall we also looked at the responsibilities of the other groups, so we have distinct responsibilities for each of our groups: board of directors, officers, employees, and shareholders. So what do we mean when we say a corporation is a separate entity or person, and what are the effects of this? Well, the corporate structure is alone among most of our entities in that it is, in fact, an artificial person. So we have created a new entity, and you recall that's the corpus, a new body that has its own rights and duties. So it is separate from the shareholders, the directors, etc. It's its own entity. What does this mean? It means that a corporation in its own name and as itself can sue or be sued. It can enter into contracts. And it has most of the rights and responsibilities that an actual person would have. So as long as it's properly set up and operating within the law, it in fact, in many regards, acts just as a person would. Obviously, we can't put the corporation in jail, but we can fine it and even apply criminal laws to a large extent as well. Okay, after deciding to operate as a corporation, what's the first step in incorporating, and then what else do we need to do? Well, not a trick question, but the first step we need to do is to decide where we're going to operate, so what state we're going to incorporate in, because as most of our business entity laws, this is a state law. This is a state function, so we would need to decide that we want to incorporate in a particular state. And that would make us a domestic corporation for that state. Now, we can incorporate in one state and even have our principal place of business in another state, but we do need to know where we're going to incorporate. What else do we need to do? Well, obviously we do the same things we've talked about with respect to other entities. So we would make sure we have a name if we're not part of a franchise. We'd get everything registered properly. And in addition to the things we do with our other entities, we now have to figure out about the stock, the management, and that sort of thing. So it is more complicated to develop and start a corporation. We'll have our articles of incorporation, which set out our very basic structure, sort of like the constitution of our corporation. And then we'll have some major laws, which will be our bylaws that we'll adopt at our first meeting. So at our first organizational meeting, the incorporators will bring together shareholders, and if directors have not already been selected, then that would happen at the first meeting as well, and adoption of bylaws, that sort of thing. What's the difference between a foreign corporation and an alien corporation? And why do these corporations need to register in the states they're operating in? Well, you recall we have 3 different flavors of corporation depending on their relationship to where they're operating. So as we just mentioned, a domestic corporation is in fact domestic with respect to the state it's incorporated in. So a Hawaii corporation operating in Hawaii is domestic with respect to Hawaii. However, if that same corporation chooses to operate in California, with respect to California, it is a foreign corporation, so it's operating in a different state. And if we have corporations operating in different countries than the country that they're from, then that would be an alien corporation. So any corporation, if it's operating in different places, can be all 3 of those depending on who's looking at them, who is categorizing them, which state or country is categorizing them. Now, why do we need to register if we're going and operating in a different state? Well, within our own state, we have already submitted ourselves to the laws of that state by incorporating. So as part of the incorporation process, we have, in essence, agreed to abide by that state's laws. If we're going and operating in a different state, that's permitted, but they want to be sure that we're going to be in accordance with their laws as well. And they want to be able to get hold of us in case something, they need to sue us or they need to regulate something we're doing, etc. So we would register with the Secretary of State or the appropriate agency as a foreign corporation or an alien corporation that intends to do business in that state. And again, we would give them address or agent or whatever for service of process and other ways of getting in touch with us and controlling what we're up to and holding us liable if necessary. In addition to publicly traded companies in the stock market, what are some of the other types of corporations? Well, you recall that some corporations are governmental, semi-governmental, and they handle public business. And the national example would be something like the Tennessee Valley Authority, actually dealing with several states, or Hawaii Housing Authority or something of that type. So this is a corporation that is there to do the public business. Operates in many regards, it may seem like a department or agency, but in fact it's a corporate structure, but it is government owned. And some people will call that a public corporation. For me, government corporation is a better term, because when we talk about publicly traded, we're actually talking about private ownership. In other words, it's owned by citizens rather than the government. So although it's a private corporation, it's a publicly traded private corporation. And it's easier just to say publicly held or publicly traded. Now, corporation could also be privately held, and that means that it's not on the stock exchange, and it's generally a more limited number of shareholders. And as we talked about, some close corporations will actually restrict who the stock can be sold to. So it's got more of a feel, it's more of an intimate, family-owned type of operation. And then, of course, there are not-for-profit or nonprofit corporations that are there also for a public purpose generally, or a charitable, educational, religious type of purpose. And they are given a tax status, so they are tax exempt because they are not there to make profits. So their money goes back into carrying out their mission. And then finally, we talked a little bit about professional corporations. And again, professional corporation was designed to essentially handle the same types of thing that our limited liability partnership was, which is to protect a professional from the negligence, the malpractice, professional negligence of one of the people that they're operating with, since those generally are one-on-one relationships. Okay, what does piercing the corporate veil mean, and when can this be done? And is this the same as ultra-vires? Okay, well, both of these terms, piercing the corporate veil and ultra-vires, are ways of resolving or dealing with corporate misuse of power or exceeding the authority of the corporation. So ultra-vires is more of an internal remedy. So in this case, the corporation itself or the shareholders can go after, sue the directors and officers if they are not properly handling the corporate affairs. So ultra-vires is essentially an internal remedy by the corporate owners. Piercing the corporate veil, on the other hand, is kind of a word picture, and you can think of the veil as being a curtain or protection around the corporation. Again, protecting the individuals involved in the corporation from personal liability for corporate debt. Now, piercing the corporate veil, again, is a word picture where we're going through that protection and we're going after the individuals and asserting personal liability for some acts that they've done. Now, when might we do this? Generally, this involves if the people are, again, word picture, hiding behind the corporate structure. So they haven't properly made the corporation. Perhaps they never intended for the corporation to act as it. And they may be commingling funds or doing other things that makes it clear this isn't a real corporation. It's a sham. So they are doing this to defraud other people, perhaps. And if the individuals involved are not treating it as a corporation, then the government and the courts are not going to treat it as a corporation either. So they may be that they will cut through that, and there will be personal liability on the officers, directors, and in very rare events, even shareholders, if they have done something to defraud or injure someone else. So this is kind of our external remedy. The piercing the corporate veil is generally somebody outside the corporation that has been damaged, as opposed to ultra-vires, which is more internal. Okay, well, today we are going to end up our review of corporate law. We're going to talk about financing, a little bit about taxation that we've hinted at before. We'll talk about securities regulation, a little bit about fraud and insider trading, a little about corporations joining together, mergers and acquisitions, talk a little bit about monopolies and antitrust, and finally just to touch on corporate responsibility. So this will kind of fill out our view of corporations. So when we talk about the owners, we're talking about people that own stock. So here we have a colorful Disney company stock certificate, a share certificate. So this is evidence of our ownership or our equity in the corporation as an owner. Used to be that Playboy stock certificates were very popular because of the visual. I haven't seen Victoria's Secret, but a number of these are quite colorful. Others look more like typical kinds of certificates. But again, this is evidence of our ownership or our equity interest in a particular corporation. So when we talk about owner's equity, also called investment capital, etc., there are really two main sources of that. One is the paid-in capital. In other words, that's the money that we have used to purchase the stock, and so that becomes capital for the corporation. And as we've talked about, corporations are much more likely to be able to raise funds when they need them, and this is one of the mechanisms, obviously, is to sell shares. Another thing that the owners have is they have an interest in the retained earnings. So the earnings of the corporation can either be paid out or they can be retained. And if they're retained, they add value to the corporation. And of course, since the shareholders are owners, they are adding value to their interest as well. Okay, so again, paid in capital is what we contribute when we purchase shares, and retained earnings is the net income earned by the corporation, which is not distributed or passed on to the owners. Okay. When we pass it on, we call it dividends, is the way that we are giving shareholders their periodic return on their investment. Okay, so the way corporations finance themselves is with equity capital, and again, that's when we sell the shares. And also they have debt capital. So that is when the corporation borrows money. And this is corporate bonds. So what the corporation does is they will sell a bond to the public, and the public will receive periodic payments back along with interest from the corporation. So this is a way the corporation can borrow substantial amounts. So these are the ways that a corporation is able to finance and secure capital. Now, where we've talked about double taxation, and we kind of hinted about what it is, but the way double taxation happens is when the profit comes in to the corporation, then the corporation has to file a tax return and pay a corporation on that profit. Okay, so that's the first taxation. As we'd expect, the corporation, in essence, is acting like a person. It's paying on the income it has received. Now, then the corporation may decide, doesn't have to, unless in its own documents, doesn't have to necessarily issue a dividend and doesn't have to be a dividend of a certain amount. But if it decides to pay out to its owners with a dividend, then that's paid after the taxes are paid. So it pays out to each of the shareholders. Now, when the shareholders receive this, they individually on their personal income taxes will need to pay tax on that. So that's where the double taxation happens. The corporation is paid when the money came into the corporation. Then when the dividends are distributed to the individual shareholders, they will pay taxes on those dividends as income received. So that's where we get double taxation on the same monies. Now, if the corporation decides not to at a particular time pay out dividends, then it will retain that money, and that will be retained earnings. But eventually, that will be taxed as well. For example, when the shareholder sells the shares, if the retained earnings have increased the value of those shares, then shareholder would have to pay tax on the gains that have happened to the value of their shares over this period of time. So pretty much one way or another, the IRS is going to get its share of both the money that the corporation has got, and then again when it gets to the owners themselves. So we do have this double taxation that is one of the downsides of the corporate structure. Now, there are some ways that a corporation can reduce this, and we'll talk in a minute about what a C corporation is, but when we talk about a corporation, that's what we're talking about. This is very similar to when we generally talked about partnership, we meant a general partnership. And here, normally when we talk about corporation, we mean a C corporation. So the ways to reduce this are, of course, we just mentioned, the corporation can retain the earnings, and then we don't pay tax at that time, although the shareholders may pay down the road. And we can make distributions that are deductible. So there are various types of things that can be given to shareholders that would not be dividends. So what would those look like? Well, we might have salary payments if they're not only a shareholder but an employee. So if we were paying them that would not qualify as a dividend. We might be rental if they are leasing to us. There might be interest if they're a creditor on a bond or something. So there may be ways that we can make payments to these shareholders that are not dividends and would not be subject to that taxation. Okay. Now, the IRS is obviously going to look pretty closely at this. This is something that the corporations would arrange with their accounting to make sure it's properly done. They may be able to return as a return on capital. And then a final way is to elect to be what we call an S corporation. So we talk about a C corporation, and there's a special status called S corporation. And this was actually one of the first corporate attempts to get the same benefits the partnership has with respect to taxation. So we've looked at this full array of entities, and in essence, they're all trying to do the same thing. They're trying to get the best of both worlds. And so this was an early attempt from the corporate side to get the partnership taxation benefits, just like the partnerships moved to limited liability to try and get the corporation protection of personal liability. So again, this whole array of entities really, for the most part, has the same aim. Okay, so there are some requirements that this is simply a tax status, so it can be the corporation has to operate a certain way, but it would be formed as a corporation as opposed to limited liability, this or that company, etc. So it is a corporation, but it's a special tax status if the corporation meets certain requirements. So it needs to be incorporated in the U.S., can only have one class of stock, and cannot be a corporation that includes partnerships and corporations or non-resident aliens. And it's usually these are smaller, may be limited in size, but if you meet these requirements, and again, you'll probably need help of someone to make sure that you're properly doing this with the IRS. If you qualify as an S corporation, then the double taxation would be reduced. Okay, so just to wrap up the double taxation question, you can see various entities are only taxed the one time. It's pass-through taxation. In other words, the owners themselves are taxed. So certainly with proprietorships, partnerships, we know are the owner and the entity are the same, so they have single taxation. Again, the various limited liability partnerships and the limited liability companies also have that pass-through taxation, and again, that's why they were developed. And then we have what we call the C corporation, the normal plain vanilla corporation, and it does have double taxation on the dividends as we've mentioned. But the S corporation generally has the same pass-through taxation, although as other corporations, there can be taxes on the gains when stock is sold. Okay, so let's look a little bit about securities law, and we'll talk about what a security is. Basically, we're talking about stocks and bonds, but if you offer to sell securities, then you are probably going to be subject to state and federal law, because this developed actually back in the stock market crash in '29, when a lot of people lost money, were devastated, and so there was a sense that there needed to be some government regulation about things that are offered to the public, making sure that things are properly done. So there's pretty strict requirements if you are offering something considered to be a security to the public. Okay, the main thing we have to do is we have to disclose material information. So we need to, if we're publicly traded, in other words, if we are on the stock market, we're going to need to be, in a large sense, transparent about how we're doing. So we need to be clear to the public, this is how the corporation is doing. Okay, we have to be very careful making statements about what the prospects are, what the condition of the company is, the status, etc. So we avoid fraud, in other words, misrepresenting what's happening in the company. Okay, we've undoubtedly heard of insider trading, and so this concerns information that is not available to the public. Again, we said that the corporation is meant to be pretty open to the public about what's going on, but of course, at various times, the corporation has information that is not available to the public, and a lot of this is properly not available. And what might that be? It might be if the corporation is involved in litigation, products liability, or something of that type. It may be if a merger's coming up or some other combination. So it can be something, either insider information, could be something that's quite good that's going to happen to the company, corporation, and the stock would go up, or it could be something that's a liability, something that's wrong in a major rollout, something's happening, and it can be bad. So you can imagine this kind of information would be quite valuable if you knew it in advance, so that you could either buy or sell stock before the general public made a run and everybody did it and the price went up or down. So again, if you could have inside information and make your decision and your purchase or sale in advance, that would be extremely valuable. Okay, so again, these happened after the stock market crash. So the Securities Act of 1933 and the Exchange Act of 1934 are to protect investors, in other words, the public, from deceptive and unfair practices when buying and selling securities. So what do we mean when we talk about securities? Well, the securities, actually, we've defined the securities. Supreme Court defined them. So it's a transaction where a person invests in a common enterprise, reasonably expecting profits derived primarily from someone else's managerial or entrepreneurial efforts. So this is pretty broad, and it doesn't cover stocks and bonds and shares that are publicly traded. So Security Act regulates all levels of that, from brokers, other people involved in solicitation, buying, selling of stocks and bonds, and tries to protect you from being defrauded through misrepresentations, omission of material facts in registration statements, prospectus, in other words, the document that offers the shares. Okay, so again, covers brokers, dealers, securities exchanges, associations, stock market. For certain types of large corporations with national exchanges, it covers all of their continuous disclosure, not just filings for initial public offerings or that sort of thing, stock offerings, but there's continuous disclosures if there are substantial assets. And substantial assets would be in excess of $5 million and 500 or more shareholders. So these companies of this size, corporations of this size, have a continuous duty to disclose what's going on. Okay, so this is regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's a federal regulatory agency, and we will talk next session a little bit more about administrative law and how these agencies operate. We've, of course, talked about a number of different agencies already, and we'll get back into that a little bit. So, again, if something's traded publicly on one of the securities exchanges like NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, then it is going to be regulated by SEC. Okay, so they investigate and prosecute security fraud. They handle the registration statements, brokers, dealers, investment advisors. Okay, well, you can see that the initial Securities Exchange Act, this was back in 1933, 1934, and in 2002 we had another major act passed. So what happened in that period of time? Well, we had a number of problems with major stock issuances and reporting by the corporations. So some of the problems had to do with, you've heard Enron, you've heard Arthur Andersen, etc. And a number of these entities were found to be misreporting, to be hiding information, to be making representations to the public that were improper. In fact, the accounting firms, some of them were dissolved because of this. So there appeared to be collusion or certainly interaction between major accounting and auditing firms and the corporations in inflating or making how a company's doing look better than it was. And this, in fact, is misrepresenting and defrauding people that are encouraged or sucked into investing in them when they're not doing that well. So the whole idea of Sarbanes-Oxley was to increase the corporate accountability so it has much stricter disclosures, harsher penalties for violations, and a critical piece is to make the CEOs personally liable for the accuracy of statements. So in the past, frequently a CEO would be issuing reports and filing paperwork, and then if it was inaccurate, the claim would be, hey, I'm not an accountant, I was relying on the auditors and the other folks, my financial people, and so, you know, I'm just the CEO, that's not my area of expertise. And so there was this kind of passing the buck sort of thing going on. And Sarbanes-Oxley essentially says, if you report it, you're on the hook for it. So it makes them personally liable for putting out that misinformation. Okay, so it actually put a public company accounting oversight board and, again, a lot more monitoring and reporting requirements. And again, when we talk about agencies, we'll see that one of the key enforcement tools of the agencies are increased reporting. So just a quick aside, some of you are probably familiar with Al Capone, the gangster back in the 30s that did murder, kidnapping, bootleg alcohol during Prohibition, etc. Did all kinds of dastardly acts, and interestingly was never captured for any of those, was never put in jail for any of those, but was put in jail. And the way he was put in jail was for income tax evasion, not reporting on his illegal gains. So an example of where you don't do the paperwork, you file false paperwork, or you don't file required paperwork, go to jail. And in essence, that is a major regulatory feature. So there's a lot more disclosure and reporting. And many instances, it's not necessary for the agency to prove the actual act, some of these other acts, simply that you have misreported what's going on, again, which is in many instances easier to do. So a lot of additional reporting goes on and that's a substantial way that the agencies keep track of folks. Okay, so again, some of the key features covering loans to officers and directors, protection for whistleblowers, enhanced penalties, etc. And you recall, whistleblower is somebody reporting on their own corporation, and so there are provisions now where some of this can be done anonymously and try and protect the whistleblowers, because even with whistleblower statutes, there's been some research that showed that the whistleblowers actually get shunned, and some of them regret having been whistleblowers when their name becomes known. So there are increased mechanisms also for allowing this to be done anonymously, sort of like the Crime Stoppers tips that you can give to the police or the IRS, etc. Okay, so in addition to the federal laws, each state has its laws, including Hawaii, and we call these blue sky laws. And again, you probably can figure it out because people were selling the sky, sort of like selling the Brooklyn Bridge or selling some nice waterfront property in Arizona, oceanfront property in Arizona. So that's where we got the term blue skies. And Uniform Securities Act, we've talked about uniform acts in the past, and many states have adopted all or part of the Uniform Securities Act. But you need to be careful here because some of the provisions may differ, as we've seen in the past, between the state and federal requirements. Okay, so mergers and acquisitions, M&A. This is an area, complicated area, but essentially when we talk about acquisition is we're talking about one company is buying another company. And often the identity of the bought company will vanish. In other words, they will simply become part of the purchasing company. Okay, so merger is a combination of two or more firms, and often when they combine in a merger, they will take a new name, so they'll form something new. Okay, so both of them are kind of gathering together different entities, but the question is whether or not one becomes part of the other or whether we're developing something new. Okay, so what are the types of mergers? Well, we have a horizontal merger, and essentially a horizontal merger means that we may be putting together competitors. So these are firms that are making and selling similar products in similar markets. So this would be two folks that are getting together that are essentially doing the same thing. Okay, and we'll talk in a minute, we'll talk about some of the concerns when all the people in a particular area decide to get together. Okay, vertical is where we're in the same actually production or process, and we're at different levels. For example, one person may make components that are used by the other company. So in essence, maybe a supplier relationship. They're contributing something that goes into that, and so that's in the single chain of making this product. Okay, and again, if you buy up the major folks that are producing a particular component, there may be concerns that you're icing out other component manufacturers. So again, we're going to be looking at what the effect this may have on competition or free market, etc., in just a little while. And a conglomerate merger is generally a merger between companies that are not related. In other words, they're not part of each other's production process, and they're not necessarily competitors doing the same thing in the same field. So those essentially are three basic types of merger. Okay, so horizontal merger, you can see we're talking about two of the same type of companies. So one example might be United Airlines and Continental Airlines have merged. So this is a horizontal merger because they, in essence, are competitors. They're doing the same thing, and by combining, they become a larger entity that is got a larger share of this particular market. So they are increasing the economies of scale, etc. So this is a horizontal merger. You can see we might have some concerns that if enough of these got together in a horizontal merger, there might be a problem because we're getting a large market share and we can perhaps dictate prices, etc. So there are a number of these types of horizontal mergers. So happens in various industries like the car industry when Daimler-Benz, Mercedes-Benz manufacturer, got together with Chrysler. It happened in the cell phone industry when AT&T and Singular got together. So these horizontal mergers happen frequently. Okay, now a vertical merger, as we said, is where we are talking about somebody that's a supplier, a major component. So there was talk for a while, Apple Computer and Intel. And you can imagine Apple Computer, we hear about potential mergers in this particular industry all the time. So if we were to use Intel only and Apple's, that sort of thing, then obviously Apple would have kind of a captive instead of having to buy this outside. They would have that in their own entity now. Okay, so that's a vertical merger where we're in the same industry and we're at different levels. We are producing something used by the other company kind of in that production chain or marketing chain. And finally, we have a conglomerate merger where we're talking about companies that aren't necessarily competitors and they're not providers or suppliers necessarily. So this could be, for example, Walt Disney and ABC, American Broadcasting Company, And you can see that there's certainly might be some good reasons for this, and they might be able to build on each other, but it's not quite the close link that we saw when you are in the same production chain or your competitors. And a lot of these conglomerate mergers, for example, there's other instances where you have Kraft Food and one of the cigarette companies, and sometimes it's a little bit head shaking. You're not sure what the intent of these are, what's the purpose. But why do companies do this? Well, hopefully some of the examples have already given you a clue on that, and you're aware of that. This will allow company growth sometimes. It can broaden product lines, it can increase technology and skill, acquire new markets. It also allows some financial benefits. So again, we talked about the possibility of combining efforts where we might reduce the necessity of employees. We also might get some economies of scale, that sort of thing. Okay, well, these may be good for the companies, but we are concerned perhaps that this is not so good for the public because, again, if you have competitors that are joining forces, what does that mean to us? Well, it means that there may be less competition. There may be what we consider to be restraint of trade. In other words, we no longer have the choices we had, and there are not any price battles, so the price is being set because there's a large market share, that sort of thing. So we're going to be concerned with this, and this arose actually quite a while ago in the 1890s when we had very large companies that were becoming very powerful, and we called those trust businesses. So that's where we got the word trust. So antitrust is actually anti those big business combinations. Okay. So you can see that the early work was done in 1890 with Sherman Antitrust Act and Clayton Act in 1914, and in the 30s we had Robinson-Patman Act. So this has been around a while that we've had this concern about businesses getting together and perhaps restraining trade, monopolizing certain areas, reducing competition, free choice, etc. Okay, so the Sherman Act prohibits contracts, combinations, or conspiracies in restraint of interstate trade or commerce. So this, again, we've talked briefly about this in the past. This concerns interstate commerce, and there are, in fact, similar types of state laws if you happen to be in one of those very rare small industries that didn't involve interstate commerce in any way. There's undoubtedly going to be a state provision that will look at this same area. But of course, nowadays almost everything is going to be interstate commerce. But again, if not, we have a state equivalent. Okay, so it includes actual and attempted monopolization. So we're going to try and prevent this before it happens. So sometimes when there's mergers on the books, they will be looked at by FTC, Federal Trade Commission, to see whether or not this is going to be allowed, because otherwise it might be a violation of one of these laws. Now, it may be hard to prove monopolization, but certainly we're going to look at market share, we're going to look at control, and again, there's quite a bit of material on exactly what we're going to be looking for to see if, in fact, trade is being restrained and there's monopolization occurring. Okay, so the Clayton Act is concerned with price discrimination, exclusive dealing, and mergers that lessen competition. So when we talk about price discrimination, we're talking about discrimination that is not have a reason outside of setting prices, price fixing. So there may be different prices offered to different customers if it has to do with different production requirements, transportation, that sort of thing. And those would not necessarily be violative. But if we can't explain why we're charging different customers different things, then we may be in violation. Okay, exclusive dealing is requiring that somebody purchase their supplies or whatever from you in restraining trade. So in essence, icing out somebody and restraining them from participating in business. Now, this is not, we've talked before about a franchisor can require a franchisee to purchase product and that sort of thing. So we're not talking about that, but we are looking to see that there are not these different kinds of arrangements that are reducing competition unfairly and restraining trade. And again, here's where we're talking about the mergers. So if it appears that a merger would substantially reduce competition, then the government may get involved and indicate that that's not going to be an approved merger. So we have seen this in the past with airlines and other large entities where it appears that we're concerned that if this merger occurs, that competition is going to be substantially reduced, and that would be a problem. So what is the problem with monopolies? What is our concern? Well, if a company becomes a monopoly and has a monopoly power over a particular industry, what can they do? Well, they could come into various areas and they could price cut. They could sell so low, they could sell below cost. And what would happen to all the other local competitors? Well, those competitors would go out of business because people would purchase the product below cost, so super bargain. What would happen then? Well, we'd put out of business all of the people other than the monopoly, and then what would the monopoly do? Well, the monopoly then could set the price. They would be the sole source of something, so after running everybody else out of business, out of bankrupting everybody else, they would then be able to set the price. There would be then no competition. So that's kind of the extreme example of what we might be concerned about is the power over the marketplace to get rid of other folks. And again, it's not just selling low, but we're talking about predatory pricing. In other words, pricing that is below cost, where the sole purpose obviously is not to make a profit, but it's to put other people out of business because you can't make it up in volume if you're losing money. So again, that's our kind of our bottom line concern with monopolies. Okay, so the Federal Trade Commission again, is concerned with the interstate commerce, and so they are looking for unfair methods of competition, deceptive acts, and both the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice are going to be enforcing the antitrust laws. And again, we do have some state law as well. Okay, so we have these controls over the corporations, but I want to talk a little bit about this kind of to take us back when we talked briefly about business ethics. Corporations are, since they are large and they involve a lot of people, they are kind of the subject of ethical discussions continuing as well. And one of the terms that has come up is corporate social responsibility. So what do we mean when we talk about corporate social responsibility? And it's even become an acronym now, CSR. And this is, you've heard of this before, this isn't new. So when we talk about business ethics or corporate ethics, that's what we're talking about. Corporate citizenship, accountability, that sort of thing. So again, in the wake of some of these corporate scandals, so to speak, this is becoming more of a hot topic. And again, not brand new, because certainly we had businesses that were, when we had apartheid in South Africa, there were businesses that would not deal with that because of social concerns. And you've probably heard about green corporations, corporations that have a high environmental standard or ethic. So this is all in that same kind of area. Okay, so one description of this is achieving commercial success in ways that honor ethical values and respect people, communities, and the natural environment. So again, what we're looking at here is kind of a broader view of who our shareholders are, our stakeholders. So our shareholders are obviously our owners, but when we say stakeholder, we're talking about something broader. So we're talking about anybody who has a stake in what the corporation is doing. So You could translate that as anybody that has an interest in or is affected by what the corporation is doing. So you can see this is a much broader clientele, so to speak. So we're not just looking at our owners or share or stockholders, but we're looking at anybody affected by what we do. Now, initial question is, do we have a responsibility to anybody other than our shareholders? Okay. If so, what is that responsibility? How do we gauge that responsibility? Now, this whole area of social responsibility is not universally accepted. So there are a number of people that say, we don't have, the corporation is artificial. It's not really a person. People can have ethical values or social responsibilities, but this is just a business. So again, somewhat controversial depending on your take on this. Okay, so who do we respond to? Who do we have a responsibility to? Well, very clearly, legally, a corporation has a responsibility to its shareholders, and it certainly has some government responsibilities. We've talked about it has some responsibilities for its employees. These are all regulated by law. So certainly the law sets out some minimal responsibilities, and we talked about that when we first looked at ethics. The law is kind of the floor. You got to do what the law says. But the question here is there something above that? If we've complied with the law, is that all that's required? Or do we have some responsibilities perhaps more than what's required by the law? Okay, well, Milton Friedman is a Nobel-winning economist, University of Chicago, and he's kind of the name we associate with those who think there's no such thing as corporate social responsibility. So he's kind of on the other side of this. And you can see what he says is the only responsibility of business is to increase its profits as long as it is legal. So for Milton Friedman, business ethics means legal, and business responsibility means make profit. So as long as you're legal and making a profit, that's it. That's what you're supposed to be doing. And anything else, he argues, is putting somebody else's needs ahead of your shareholders, and your shareholders are who you are responsible to. So lots been written on this, and he's written a fair amount of it. Now, of course, there are many things on the other side, and our materials include discussions on both sides of this issue. Okay, so if we do look at responsibilities, even Milton agrees that we have some economic and legal responsibilities. So you look at the two at the bottom here, and both of these everybody agrees on. You got to obey the law, and you got to make profits because that's who you're responsible to. Okay, so we agree on those. But the question with the CSR, with the corporate social responsibility is there something on top of that? And this formulation, I believe, was first done by someone else named Carroll. So I think Abel Carroll. Anyway, so the additions here would be, is there a corporate ethic requirement? And is there something even on top of that which is for the public good, kind of a philanthropic or being a good corporate citizen? Okay, so you might add those on top of it. But again, we all agree that you got to be legal, you got to make profit. The question is there more required? Okay, so you can see there are a whole bunch of different concerns, operating with nonprofits, advancing human rights, being green. And everybody wants to be green, at least in the public eye, but there's kind of a backlash now where some companies are spending more money appearing to be green, appearing to be environmental friendly, than they are actually advancing that. So you can see all of these things that we consider to be social good. Question is, are these corporate responsibilities? Okay, and just finally, just want to take a look at what the concerns, ethical concerns are with businesses. You can see some of these have been in the news: improper accounting, major ethical issue, deceptive marketing, people in the corporate structure with conflicts of interest, falsifying records, being dishonest with their customers or employees, unfairly treating customer employees, bribes, kickbacks, etc. So you can see a number of the things we've talked about, Sarbanes-Oxley, etc., certainly are meant to address the worst of these, the accounting and the records and that sort of thing. But some of the rest of these are, again, they're ethical concerns, also legal concerns when the law has taken the ethics into statute. Okay, what are the red flags for ethics for a corporation? Well, it's advisable to have a code of ethics and to transmit that to your employees. If you're looking for a quick fix, in other words, get it out of sight, out of mind. If you're concerned about it's going to cost us money to fix this. If it's just public relations, again, as we talked about, being environmentally sensitive, are you just doing it for the PR, or is really what you think? Lack of clear procedures on how to handle this. Again, this kind of harkens back when we were talking about handling something even more serious like sexual harassment. You got to have good procedures. How do we make sure that we're up to snuff if this is an area of interest to us? You do training; it has to be top down. Your CEO has to take the lead in it, because your employees down the chain will be following what the CEO does. So, again, we've just touched on this social responsibility, but it is a live area. And again, there is a whole lot more that's on the website that will explain this and give you different opposing views and what companies are doing in this area. So, well, that kind of wraps us up with corporations. Next time we're going to be looking at administrative law. So we're going to be looking at departments and agencies and the law they produce that affects us both as business and consumers. So I will see you next time. Aloha.